So what I said was try to sum it up in the smallest amount of words that you can, just so you have a good idea of what Darwin saw and what this led him to think about in terms of evolution. So the second point was that he found fossils that looked kind of like current organisms. Specifically, the picture in your textbook shows a glyptodont, which is a fossil that was found in South America, and a modern armadillo, which currently exists, and the fact that they look fairly similar. And so he asked himself, what's the relationship between these things? Why do I find them in the same area? Why is there a fossil that looks kind of like this organism, but not exactly like this organism? Why are they in the same place? Is there a link between them? Do they have something to do one with the other? So the question in the textbook said, why would living and fossilized organisms that looked similar be found within the same region? So I really want to focus on the idea of similarity here, the fact that they were similar. They're not identical, right? He's not saying that a glyptodont was an armadillo, but he's like, hey, they look kind of the same, and they were found in the same spot. So maybe this means something in terms of change, because remember, the old idea was that organisms did not change over time. The old idea was that all organisms have existed in their current state since they started existing, and things have not adapted. The third thing that he found was that the organisms in South America were very similar to the ones in the islands that he was on. So it says, the finches and other animals Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands closely resembled animals he had observed on the west coast of South America. And so he's again asking himself here something about the proximity of these organisms. Point one, which we did yesterday, I said he was really asking himself, why is there a distribution pattern? Why is what he saw in Europe not the same as what he's seeing in South America? And point three is really another point about that same thing. He's asking himself about the distribution of organisms. If things are just created and they do not change over time and their environment has nothing to do with it, why are the things that are close to South America really similar to the things that are in South America? The thing that's often mentioned here is the idea of geography. We'll talk about it maybe in a little bit, but you probably are aware that the reigning theory of what our planet used to look like is that at one point all of the continents were attached to each other and that things have separated. And so even at this point in time, people understood that islands that were close to mainland were probably attached to that mainland at some point in time. And so that might help explain why the organisms that are in those islands close to South America look fairly similar. The fourth point is the big one that shows you the pictures of all the finches. The finches are probably the most famous of all the organisms that Darwin studied. He did a lot of research with them and did a lot of sort of cataloging of what was going on. So I'm just going to sum this up. He saw that the beaks on all of these types of finches were different. They were all finches, so they were all the same general type of bird, but they had different looking beaks, so they were different species, but they all lived in the same place. So, what caused the diversity? Did it have to do with some sort of adaptation? So suggesting that these were all perhaps started from the same type of bird and that over time they adapted to things was quite different than the old idea about evolution. And the last point was about artificial selection and sexual reproduction, and the fact that they provided diversity. So, for example, he knew that if you wanted a particular type of dog, you could mate these two dogs together and this would give you the type of dog that you wanted. Same thing with flowers. We knew at this point that parents could pass their traits on to offspring, and we also knew that if the two parents were different, then the offspring was likely to have some other mix of characteristics. And he wondered, could something like this happen in nature? So, is something like natural selection possible? So up until this point, no one said natural selection because he's the one who's going to coin this term, use this theory. Artificial selection means that we are deciding which organisms are going to mate with each other. But he's wondering, is there something that happens in nature that sort of determines which organisms mate with which ones, that isn't a decision we're making, but maybe something about their environment or something about what's happening? So these are all the things that Darwin saw, and this is what led him, as well as Wallace, let's not forget him, to come up with the theory of natural selection. So this is what you should have had from yesterday. This next part is new. So we are still comparing Lamarckian, so that's Jean Lamarck, the guy that said that the giraffe stretched its neck because it wanted to, and Darwinian explanations of change. Lamarck said organisms changed because they wanted to. This is going to explain what Darwin said about why organisms were changing. So we're talking about the theory of natural selection. So if you want to give this a title, that's what we're discussing, natural selection. In natural selection, there is not a human, let's say, making some sort of decision in terms of who is going to survive and who is going to reproduce. In the theory of natural selection, there are several points that help explain it. The first point is that of overproduction. And so Darwin saw that more organisms were born than the environment could support. Now this is true for basically every species except maybe our own. We have found a bunch of ways to circumvent nature and to support more organisms than maybe our environment allows. But that's not true everywhere in the world. If you think about other countries, other places in the world, this would be true in a lot of places. There are more organisms born in each generation than can possibly be supported. So there's this idea of overproduction. So I've got a little picture up here illustrating a parent and their possible offspring. Now, just for simplicity, I'm showing just a few of them here. This isn't representative of the vast number of things that would exist. But we know that for variation to occur, there should be some sort of sexual reproduction happening. Now, that's not true for every single species, but in most of the cases that Darwin observed, this was part of the deal. So from a parent or from a set of parents, there would be several offspring. So this row here would be the offspring. And if you notice, I just use shading here, the offspring do not all look the same. So the second point that Darwin put as part of his theory was that there were variations. There were differences among the offspring. Now we know now some reasons that offspring might not look the same as parents. We know about DNA, we know about genes, and we know about mutations. So why is an offspring not the same as their parent? Well, if it was produced with sexual reproduction, it's getting a combination of DNA, so a combination of genes, from both parents. Even if it's not produced through sexual reproduction, DNA mutations happen all the time. Every time DNA is copied, like even within your own body from one cell to the other, it's highly probable that one or more of the little tiny pieces that make up the sequence of your DNA gets misplaced or gets put in the wrong order. And so each time a new generation happens, the probability of mutations happening to DNA is increased. Are mutations all bad? Absolutely not. Mutations can be helpful. Mutations could also be negative, or they could be nothing. They could change nothing for the organism. So chances are, if we were to examine your DNA and compare it to that of your parents, you would have slight changes in the order of your DNA that did nothing to increase your survival or decrease your survival. Maybe it made your hair one shade lighter or your skin one shade darker, and that probably is not affecting your survival or your ability to pass your characteristics on to the next generation. So mutations don't have to give you a characteristic that's good or bad. They could do nothing. The next point is that there is a struggle for existence. And by this, we mean that there is competition for limited resources and mates. So again, maybe our species is not the best example because we have ways to circumvent our ability to find resources. For example, I was talking to my husband the other day, and he said, well, we're at the top of our food chain. And I said, are we really? Who am I hunting? I'm not hunting the cow. I go to Sobeys and buy food. So unless you're saying Sobeys is part of my food chain, I'm not at the top of any sort of food chain. I'm not hunting something. I'm not chasing it down and just eating it out in the ocean. So like if I'm going to eat a lobster, I don't go catch it and eat it. I go to Sobeys and they put it in a box for me. They'll even cook it for me if I want to. But for most organisms, the resources are out there, and there's quite a bit of competition for them. For resources, we could need anything from food, water, shelter. It doesn't just have to be food. It doesn't just have to be prey. But definitely, there's also competition for mates. There's lots of species where, in particular, the males will have to put on quite a show to be the one chosen by the female for reproduction. So in the next row of my picture, there is an X. One of those three offspring, who were all different from each other, did not have something that was favorable. They had an unfavorable mutation. So something about their DNA, the differences that they had, made it unfavorable for them. So just as an example, I'm going to say that that offspring was blind. That is not very favorable. If you can't see, the chance of you beating out someone else in a competition for resources is reduced. So in this particular imaginary example, that one offspring was blind. They couldn't see, and so they did not win any competitions, and they did not survive. That means that in the next generation, so now those organisms that were the original offspring, they're going to have their own offspring. In the next generation, notice how the lightest color doesn't show up anymore. When an organism has a characteristic that's not favorable, it is not going to win the competition, and it is not going to be able to pass its characteristics on. So there's still another point, but I'm going to switch to the next screen. Does anyone want to ask anything before I do that? So this is the same picture. Nothing has changed except that we are talking about this section now. So the first 3 points kind of set the stage. And then the fourth point is really the explanation for why some survive and some don't and why things get passed on. Darwin said that the survival of the fittest happens. So we already said at the beginning that meant an organism that was best adapted would survive. So, organisms with favorable traits survive and are more likely to reproduce and pass on their DNA. So in the next generation, we already saw that the lightest color of the 3 offspring didn't reproduce. It didn't survive long enough to reproduce. And so in the second generation, there's no light-colored organisms left. So that would be an explanation for why sometimes a characteristic disappears or fades out of a population. Now notice how each of these organisms that came from the 2 parents that actually reproduced, they're not the same either. We have a light gray, a dark gray, medium gray, and the really, really dark one at the end. So they all have variation. So the idea of variation is there in every single generation. So is the idea of overproduction. There were 4 offspring, and obviously there was not enough resources to support 2 of them. So these 2 are dead. There was not enough food. They weren't tall enough to reach the top of the tree. So they did not get enough food and they did not survive. So we'll say these ones were too short. That means that only these other 2 who were tall survived long enough to reproduce, and their characteristics get passed on. If I were to repeat this a whole bunch of times, we would see that over time, favorable traits increase in a population, while unfavorable ones decrease. So this little example is showing you 3 generations. A parent had some offspring, one of them died. The 2 that were left reproduced. A couple of those died. The 2 that were left reproduced. That's only 3 generations. When I say over time, I mean many, many, many generations. So not just 1 or 2 or 3, but like hundreds of generations are usually necessary for a characteristic to completely disappear or for a characteristic to sort of take over in a population. The thing that I want you to notice is that an organism did not change themselves. They were the way that they were, starting from when they were born, but it was their offspring that was different. The last thing that we'd have to add to the theory of natural selection is how Darwin would have explained that new species formed. And generally, we would still accept this method to be true today. Speciation, then, is the word that describes the formation of new species via isolation. Now, if you read what Darwin said that they were geographically isolated from each other. And what we'll talk about is that perhaps that doesn't have to be the only way that isolation can happen. But what we're saying is that a new species will form when organisms are isolated from each other, meaning that they cannot reproduce with each other. So if I were to take a species and take a group of them, and sort of split them in half, put a barrier between them, and make it so that they couldn't communicate or couldn't reach each other. Eventually, the two halves might become so different after generations and generations and generations of reproducing and not being able to share characteristics that two new species would form. So over here, I have my original ancestor. And we're saying that some sort of isolation happened here. And that means that a group of these organisms were split up. Some of them were in one area, some of them in another. And over a very long period of time, the organisms in one area became different or started having different characteristics than the organisms in another area. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about a bit later is that speciation can happen a couple of different ways. Sometimes when new species form, the original ancestor no longer exists, and that's what this example is sort of showing, that A turned into B and C. But in other scenarios, we'll see that the original ancestor still exists, but there's another species that's related to it, so they don't have to necessarily replace each other. There are two words that we would want to use when we're talking about evolution and the formation of new species. The first is microevolution. Micro means small. So microevolution is something that's small. If I was going to define microevolution, we would talk about small changes in the characteristics of a population. And a very good example that I could give of this is the peppered moth. It's a pretty famous, pretty common example. Do any of you know the history of the peppered moth, or what the peppered moth is? So the peppered moth is a species that that still does exist. But the peppered moth showed an example of microevolution. Microevolution is usually something that you could see in a regular human lifetime, so it doesn't take thousands of years to happen. The peppered moth lives in Europe, well, or some of them do anyways. And what we saw happen with the peppered moth was a very distinct change in the predominant color. So originally, there were many white and few that were black. So the peppered moth has sort of two different color possibilities, either mostly white wings with like little black specks on them, or sort of the opposite, mostly black wings with little white specks on them. And in the beginning, there were many white and few black, probably because it was very easy for predators to see a black moth. It contrasted better with the birch trees in the forests where it usually lives. Then came the Industrial Revolution. And what did we see? We saw the population change. There were many black and very few white peppered moths. Now, did a new species of moth form? No. Microevolution is not quite the formation of a new species. It's a small change in the characteristics of a population that you can usually observe in a human-sized lifetime. What we saw was that during the Industrial Revolution, where pollution started being more prevalent, especially things colored darkly like soot, this would cover the trees, and now black moths were more well camouflaged, and so their numbers increased in the population because they were able to survive and reproduce, and the number of white moths decreased. So microevolution is not quite speciation. It might lead to the formation of a new species eventually, but microevolution doesn't mean that a new species has formed. just that in a population, which means one species, we see changes in the characteristics. Macroevolution, macro means big. This takes time, lots and lots and lots of time, and this is where we would have speciation. So there are many examples of macroevolution, but the idea of our species, Homo sapiens, originating with other species like Homo erectus or Homo neanderthalensis that came before us, that is an example of macroevolution because it took thousands of years for these changes to happen. They were not visible in one lifetime span. So macroevolution would refer to speciation. Microevolution isn't quite enough to be speciation.